Welcome to Bad Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
And I'm Albert Berg, and Tony is having our bad idea for this week. Tony, what are you talking about?
Today we're going to be talking about Milli Vanilli.
That sounds like a disgusting flavor of ice cream.
I'm sure there's some sort of flavor of ice cream named after these guys. It would probably be pretty fake. Like some sort of diet ice cream. But anyway, in the late 1980s, the French and German R&B duo Milli Vanilli burst onto the scene. Fat Morvan and Rob Pilatus put out an album called Girl You Know It's True, and it took over the Billboard charts. Essentially, they had 5 songs that broke the top 5 of this Billboard chart, and 3 of them actually hit the #1 spot. By 1990, their record had gone platinum 6 times, which means they sold more than 6 million albums.
You know, I have heard of Milli Vanilli. I was making a little joke at the top of the show. However, I just kind of assumed that it was a female-fronted band of some kind because of the name Milli Vanilli.
I can see that.
I am shocked that this is 2 dudes. Not that has anything to do with, like, the quality that they put out. I've just been laboring under this misconception my entire life, and it's very weird to have it ripped away from me,
Well,
Tony.
you might want to Google it because it's 2 black guys with braided hair. One Frenchman, one German man.
That makes almost more sense.
Well, the European part makes a little bit more sense with that, but it's still a very odd name. I was doing a lot of digging, and I actually didn't find where the name came from for these guys. But basically, Milli Vanilli was getting huge. In a 1990 interview for Time magazine, Rob Pilatus said that Milli Vanilli was the new Elvis, and that their success meant that they were more talented than Bob Dylan, Paul McCartney, and Mick Jagger. This came freshly off of winning a Grammy for Best New Artist. And basically, these 2 models had almost everything. Charisma, good looks, stage presence, all the things you need to become a pop star. All except that they couldn't sing. Every word on all of the records they ever put out was recorded by other people.
Are you serious?
Yes, I am absolutely serious. Didn't matter if it was the rap sections, the harmony sections, everything that they did was recorded by other people. This was basically a front set up because producers knew that in the MTV era, it was more important to have style than it was to have talent. So they got the talented people to be in the background and put these 2 guys right up in front.
I've heard of things like this before, Tony. I know, for instance, that the Monkees were sort of chosen to be a less edgy version of the Beatles, and they're put together by producers, and a lot of artists today sort of have that same stigma. Yeah. I've never heard of a group like this, though, that was just complete fiction.
Yeah. Well, it's like you look at the Spice Girls or something like that, and each of them were chosen and kind of forced, or not really forced, they were chosen to be in a 5-person band, but they actually could sing, they knew how to do the dancing, they knew how to do all that stuff. Like, they were put together, but it was still a band where they were doing the singing.
At least some of the time.
Yeah. I'm sure that some of their... Well, I'm not 100% certain on that. I would guess that some of their live shows had some lip-syncing. Simon Cowell from American Idol talked about how he didn't really think it would be a problem for people to go to a show to see lip-syncing because they're there for the lights, for the people, for the sound. And if it's just a little bit better quality, then they might as well be lip-syncing. I definitely disagree with this because I think that's like the real reason why you should be going, is because the band is incredibly talented and could put on a live show. It's like the first band I ever saw was Weird Al, and he put on a hell of a show. Like every band that I've gone to, it's been very calculated because I knew I was going to be going to a show where they were actually very good.
But that's a far... I have heard of Milli Vanilli. I have heard of this controversy, Tony. I just thought it was because they were lip-syncing on stage.
No.
And I always thought, okay, maybe you're going to blow your voice out. You're touring, 5 nights a week or whatever, screaming your lungs out. Maybe you need to have a little bit of help every once in a while. But you're telling me that these guys never sang.
Never sang. And I'll get more into whenever they tried to prove that they could sing later. But I'm
looking forward to that.
There's actually something that happens in hip-hop where they've got a hype man to finish like the last couple words of each bar so that the rapper can actually take a breath, so it's not quite as fast as what they do on records, things like that. So there are a lot of ways around like the whole like not being quite able to perform as well as you can in studio. but this was just entirely fabricated.
Did people know? Like, people had to suspect, right?
Yeah. Well, there were a lot of rumors that something was amiss with these two. They both had really thick accents, especially in the early 90s whenever they first came on the scene. In interviews, they would go on there, and Rob's voice was a lot deeper than it sounded whenever he was singing, and he also had a very thick accent that he would sometimes trip over. Sometimes you really can hide an accent whenever you're singing. Like, there's a lot of British singers that just sound like it's flat out like an American singing. There's no hint of any sort of accent. So a lot of people just attributed to that. Or they thought that they might have been vocally coached enough that whenever they were doing the repetitive thing, the repetitive song over and over again, that they had been able to actually nail those words, but kind of being impromptu in an interview, they weren't able to speak as well.
I can see that. Especially if you're a fan of this music. You're like, hey... you can come up with justifications.
Yeah. And I think the thing that caused the most of people wondering what was going on with it was the rap sections. Like, a lot of their songs had these little rap breakdowns, and it straight up sounded like a West Coast rapper. Like, there was no hint at all of any sort of accent. And they even kind of took on a different persona while they were singing those parts of that. It would turn out later that Gary Shaw was the one doing the rap portions of this. But on July 21st, 1989, now infamous concert at Lake Compounce, I think that's how you say that, Compounce theme park in Connecticut, started their downward spiral. It was live on MTV, and while they were singing their biggest hit, Girl You Know It's True, the track got stuck on a short loop, repeating over and over again. It was basically, girl you know it, just over and over and over again. And for a little bit, the guys tried to just kind of roll with it. They were dancing around, and, like, if you've ever been to a live show, you know, sometimes they get a little improv with stuff like that. They might have a longer solo, or they might repeat a chorus a little bit extra. But after about the 15th loop, they sort of panicked and just ran from the stage. At the time, 80,000 people looked around, kind of shocked and confused, not really knowing what was happening. But right after that, the band returned to the stage, and the rest of the concert went off without a hitch. According to MTV VJ Downtown Julie Brown, also millennials, a VJ is somebody, it's not what you think it is. It's not short for various sexual things. It's a video jockey from MTV when MTV actually played music. They were the ones that selected the videos. Like, think of...
And a DJ is a guy that plays records on the radio.
Yeah, like back whenever they actually
Weirdly
had to do
enough,
things.
you guys still know that term. But VJ has fallen out of favor.
Or fallen into another parlance if you go to Urban Dictionary.
Cha-ching.
But she said that people weren't really fazed by it. They were still having fun, and, like, it wasn't unheard of for an artist to do lip syncing for a big live show. Like, it didn't matter if it was an award show or things like that. Every once in a while, you'd notice that the music wasn't quite queued up, and they were just there doing a performance. At this point, the rumors started to spread a lot more, and singer Charles Shaw publicly revealed that he was one of the 3 real musicians on the record that Fab and Rob were complete imposters. The group's founder and producer quickly paid Shaw $150,000 to retract his statement, but the damage was already done. And even his retraction was sort of a play on words, because Gary Shaw was the one who did the rap parts. In his retraction, he basically told the press, "I did not sing on this album." He did not say that he did not rap on the album, only that he did not sing on the album.
Which was technically true.
Yes.
If you don't think rapping is singing. Is rap singing? Is rap music, Tony?
I think it's music, but you could definitely argue that the way most people rap isn't exactly singing. It's more spoken word poetry with a hard beat behind it. So I understand where he's coming from with that. Like, and for $150,000, I might twist my words a little bit too. But after some investigation, the group's founder, Frank Farian, admitted that the group had been lip-syncing tracks done by Charles Shaw, Brad Howell, John Davis, Jody Rocco, and Linda Rocco. And basically, the cat was out of the bag. 20 million total records were sold under false pretenses. The actual singers were buried deep in obscurity because Frank Farian knew that presentation was more important than actual talent.
I am fascinated by this, and I have to know, was the music any good?
By 90s standards, it was pretty good. Like, if you go back and listen to some of their bigger songs, it's not my style of music, but you can understand why people enjoyed it. It was very poppy, very romantic, very very R&B for the time, like before like Boyz II Men and some of these other bands kind of took over for them. I could definitely see why people were into it. Like, it was very well produced too. Everything was very crisp, and it was a different sound. It was just very good for the time. Early 90s stuff and late 80s stuff is not my jam for the most part, unless it's grunge, though.
I know that there are European groups as well that maybe they are doing the singing, but it's not like a band that you would see typically where you have the sort of basic members and maybe you switch somebody out, but you still have the core group.
Yeah.
They will just use a name and tour with the name and the popularity of the name and just get whatever good singers they can to sing their hit songs. I'm forgetting the name of the group. They did, Cotton Eye Joe was the big hit that these guys had.
I couldn't tell you who originally sang Cotton Eye Joe.
Well, I think it's like a folk, well, I don't know for sure, but I think it's a folk song.
It's always been a favorite at sporting events and stuff because people get so into that song. It's just silly and it's a good time. But I think I've heard of more what you're talking about. Usually it's more a front person just hires like a band to go with them. Like Michael Jackson had a band, but I don't think it was always the same members. Like, it wasn't like Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, where the Heartbreakers were always with him and it was the same people.
Right. Rednecks is the band, by the way. A Swedish musical group called Rednecks. And according to some things that I've seen, they switch out members basically like you would switch out a light bulb.
It's like, who gets to be the ultimate one deciding that, I wonder?
I don't know, but it raises an interesting question about music production. We like to think of things, movies, music, all this stuff as being sort of the product of a single person. We get behind directors or possibly an actor that we're really excited about, the musical artist. But these days, nothing's the product of one person.
Yeah, definitely
Art
not.
is sort of a huge production, and things like this, I would imagine. I'm almost surprised it's not more common.
Yeah. Well, it took 20 people to write "Baby, Baby, Baby" for Justin Bieber, and it took one person to write "Bohemian Rhapsody." So it's one of those things where times have changed.
True that.
But after all of this was brought to light, Milli Vanilli's Grammy Awards were withdrawn. The duo had a live press conference in which they talked about what happened, and they were willingly handing their Grammys back. In the interview, they talked about what it was like to basically sign a deal with the devil, because these were two 18-year-old guys that loved music. They met up in Germany. They didn't actually, like, one spoke French, one spoke German, but they both spoke English, so they kind of just made it work. They had fun making music together, and they just wanted to be a part of the music industry. So they end up talking to a producer that locks them into a contract. Basically doesn't tell them that the first album that they're going to be doing has already been produced and that they're just going to be the ones lip syncing to it. And he promises them that eventually they'll be able to sing for their own albums, but they already have this produced and they think that they would be perfect for it. So it's something where these two singers weren't in, like, they were complicit in that they acted on it, but it wasn't entirely their fault that it went so far. Like, they thought that this first album was just going to be nice, easy, just get them known a little bit, and then they'd be able to bring their own flavor, their own writing, their own everything to it. And instead, they were just locked into these draconian contracts that made it so that they had to keep going. And I'm sure by that point, having the money and having everything else made it a little bit easier to do. But there was just so much going on behind the scenes here that led them to being pressured into it.
That sounds pretty tragic.
Yeah, it really does, and like it gets more tragic as we move on.
I'm reading ahead here, and I see that. I do want to jump in here and just in the defense of this idea say, it seems like if you were upfront with something like this ahead of time and just said, listen, it's just a performance, maybe you would get away with it a little easier instead of trying to fool people.
Yeah.
People don't like to be fooled.
And that definitely shows later whenever they try to kind of come back from all this. In an effort to prove that they could sing, the duo released video recordings of them singing their biggest hits in studio, and these recordings really lacked the silky smooth quality that people had grown used to from hearing Milli Vanilli, and the public just was not having it. Especially because Fab was a little bit better than Rob at actually reproducing the sound, and he actually still to this day will go and do concerts where he sings the old Milli Vanilli hits, and with the voice coaching, with repetition and everything, he's actually gotten pretty decent at it. But whenever you get to the like Girl You Know It's True part and you just hear Pilatus sing it, it's brutally bad. And I was cringing pretty hard just watching these videos that they put out. And more cringy than that, during this press conference, they stood up and started singing, and it was just as bad as you would think it would be in a press conference with no background music and them just getting grilled by the press and trying to prove themselves.
Yeah, acapella, man, yeah.
It's like if you're gonna go,
I can imagine
go acapella in a room that's not made for singing, you better have some pipes to prove it.
Yeah, I was gonna say, even someone who knows how to do acapella probably isn't gonna drop something super impressive just in a random place. Like, you want to get somewhere where people could get your voice to carry. And, you know, the sound design is important in a room.
Yeah, sure.
Maybe these guys would know that if they had sung ever before.
Shortly after this, the real Milli Vanilli, composed of the actual singers, released a record called The Moment of Truth. The record did not sell that well, but was re-released in America under the name Try and Be. Under that name, the record actually did pretty well, but it never reached the heights that Milli Vanilli were able to.
Try and Be.
Yeah, Try, apostrophe N, apostrophe B was the name of that band. At this point, Rob and Fab were still desperate to prove that they weren't entirely frauds, so they got back together and released a single, We Can Get It On, which sold a mere 2,000 copies. I was just kind of surprised that people were willing to sign them to another record label at this point.
And for a song called We Can Get It On, sung by two dudes from Europe.
Yeah.
That might have not been the most intelligent decision to pull yourself out of this situation.
Well, like, they've always had some kind of weird titles for the things that they actually made. Like, in 1997, they would come back together and decide to produce a new Milli Vanilli record under the Milli Vanilli name called Back and in Attack. And by this time, singer Rob Pilatus had developed a problem with drugs and alcohol. He'd also been arrested for a series of assaults and robberies. He was sentenced to 3 months in prison and 6 months in drug rehab. After all of these problems were resolved, they were gearing up for a new tour to promote the new album. And the night before the promotional tour was set to launch, Pilatus was found dead of an alcohol and prescription drug overdose. There's a lot of people that suspected this was suicide, but the death was ultimately ruled accidental.
So hard to tell in those cases.
Yeah, like, because
by the time you're that far down the tube, you're already probably don't have a great life if you're turning to drugs to make things better.
Yeah, especially whenever you're having to rob and steal and everything, whenever you were a pop star that sold 20 million records at one point. It's such a huge about face that a lot of people would never be able to deal with that sort of switch in stardom. At this point, the tour was obviously canceled and the recordings were destroyed. It was truly the end of Milli Vanilli. I'm kind of surprised they didn't actually release that album, just because it seems like there's a lot of people in the music industry and in Hollywood that would be all over using that sort of press to push a record out, but in this case, they actually did not.
Are you telling me that this album just doesn't exist anymore?
Yep. That's what the sources were telling me. I wouldn't be surprised if somebody somewhere has it and it someday gets released, but it's been 20 years since that record was supposed to come out, so it's missing its window a little bit if it ever does find the light of day.
Yes.
But in several interviews, Fab Morvan talked about the pressure, the fear, the depression that was associated with being known as a fraud. About how for years it just ate away at them while they were still touring, while they were so big. And there were a lot of times where they were able to really convince people that this was them singing. They would bring women on stage and like basically sing directly at them 2 inches away, and like people looked like they were fully enamored and fully into the moment of what was happening. Like, they were very, very good showmen. They were good dancers. They looked the part. Everything about them was great, but they just couldn't break away from being the fraud in this. Like, they were never able to recover. And it really is a tragic story because it seemed like they were nice enough guys. And thankfully, Fab has done a little bit better for himself than his counterpart. Like, he is still working in the music industry. He's making EDM, like electronic dance music, for anyone who doesn't know. And he does a lot of samples where he's singing on it, but it's mostly about the beats and mostly putting itself out there. And he produces some music and just lives a very quiet life in Amsterdam. He'll occasionally do concerts where he performs the Milli Vanilli stuff. And whenever I was watching these interviews, he seems like he's genuinely in a much better spot. Like, he's been able to mourn like the loss of his stardom, of his friends, of all these things that he went through, and he actually weathered it pretty well.
Well, good for him.
We usually like to recap the bad idea here, and it's pretty obvious what that is. It's just don't don't let yourself fall into fraud. Like, if you're going to be doing a performance, if you're going to be doing something like that, just let people know up front. Maybe you might not have sold 20 million records, but you really could have done pretty well with the music that was produced. Or you could have just taken the slightly less attractive people, because it's not like the people that made the Milli Vanilli records were actually bad looking. They just wanted a very, very specific style of these two black models. And I think that if they would have just started out with the actual people who made the record, they would have done pretty well. So it's just, you got to be authentic, and you really aren't going to be able to keep up a ruse forever. Like, this barely lasted, I think, 3 years before everything was sort of done for Milli Vanilli. It was like 1988 to 1991, really.
Those are days in the sun. Girl, you know it.
Anyway, thank you all for listening to another episode of Bad Ideas. If you have bad ideas that you want us to take a look at, send them to badideashow@gmail.com. If it's something that we think we can get an episode out of, we will definitely attribute it to you. Otherwise, if you enjoyed this, be sure to check out our YouTube, youtube.com/Human Echoes, for a lot of cool gaming content, or our Patreon if you really want to support us. $2, $5, $10, or $20 a month. And basically, all these different tiers get you cool stuff, from buttons to the bonus podcast to all sorts of other stuff. So be sure to check that out.
Take it easy, guys.
Bye, everybody.